Good evening. Welcome to the latest episode of SABR Deadball Era Book Talks. With our author tonight is John Zinn. We're really excited to have John. John's been a SABR member since 1996. He has written 3 books with large Deadball era content. The first, well, I don't know if I'm going to get these in order, but the 3 are the Major League Pennant Races of 1916, which is subtitled The Most Maddening Baseball Melee in History, which he co-authored with Paul Zinn. A biography of Charles Ebbets, subtitled The Man Behind the Dodgers and Brooklyn's Beloved Ballpark. One on Ebbets Field, Essays and Memories of Brooklyn's Historic Ballpark from 1913 to 1960, which he edited along with Paul Zinn. And then among his other books, among John's other books, he also wrote A Cradle of the National Pastime, New Jersey Baseball from 1855 to 1880. John is a lifelong New Jersey resident and has co-authored books with his son, as I just mentioned, and we will ask him about that later. That's got to be a little bit interesting. He's a graduate of Rutgers and a Vietnam veteran. He is also the scorekeeper for the Flemington Neshahannock Vintage Baseball team. And if you want to follow John regularly, he has a baseball history blog at perfect for vintage baseball followers, a manlypastime.blogspot.com. So John, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Dan. Thanks for everybody for attending.
So why don't I just ask you the first question, since this is a SABR podcast. How did you first get interested in SABR?
What happened was that in 1996, Carol, my wife, and Paul, my son, and I were in Cooperstown. And we had been there many times before, but we were there to attend what was then the annual exhibition game between 2 major league teams. And we were walking through the parking lot at Doubleday Field, and there were a lot of tables set up in the parking lot for, I guess, primarily for local groups advertising what they did. And there was this one table for the Society for American Baseball Research. And I'm not sure if I knew about SABR before that, but I started looking at the information, talked to whoever was there, and this sounded like it was right up my alley. I think I joined on the spot, although I might have waited until we got home. But that's when I started. That's how I really found out about it. I do remember that one of the part of the application process was saying what your interests were, and that right at the head of my list was the Deadball era. And I've been a member ever since. Gotten a lot out of it, and I hope contributed as well.
That's a good story. Everyone needs an origin story how they got in SABR, and that's a pretty good one.
Right.
Well, that's a great segue. So what is it about the Deadball era that you found so fascinating?
What got me interested in the Deadball era was a book called My Greatest Day in Baseball, which was a selection of short oral histories that were published in the Chicago Daily News beginning in 1943. And I read this selection of about 50 of them in the mid-1950s when I was about 10 years old. And the memories, especially of Ty Cobb and Mordecai Brown, just intrigued me with the atmosphere they described of Deadball era games, the intensity, and I think above all, the strategy. I've never been somebody who's been for the home run and all that kind of thing. I love the inside baseball part of it. I hate the term small ball, but that kind of baseball has always intrigued me. And so that's what got me started on the Deadball era.
So talk a little bit about how you got interested in writing books. Maybe your first book and what got you excited about getting into your first book.
Yeah, I was an avid reader from childhood on, but then when I finished my formal education, I started getting interested not just in the books I was reading, but how the people who wrote them did that, and started to be one of the only people I knew when I read a book, the first thing I did was read the acknowledgments where the author talked about how he or she went about their work. And I ultimately decided I wanted to write a book on my own. Now, life, as it always does, got in the way. And it wasn't until about that time that I joined SABR Paul was about to go off to college, so I finally had a little bit more time, and I wanted to try it, and I wanted to try it in something that I considered very manageable. So for several reasons, it wasn't baseball. It was to write the story of a New Jersey regiment in the Civil War. And I wrote that book called The Mutinous Regiment, and it was published by McFarland. And then with that done, having met that first goal, then I was ready to take on something larger, and that was definitely going to be baseball, and it was definitely going to be the Deadball era.
So your first Deadball book, and I'm going to go back a little bit and just talk about sort of the process
Sure.
and for a minute, but just how did you pick a subject for your first Deadball book? How did you get excited about your first Deadball book? What was the impetus to saying, all right, now I'm going to do a book on the Deadball, and this is my topic?
The first book was the book about the 1916 pennant races.
Yep.
And I'm old enough that I really remember the winner take all pennant races. My first pennant race was the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1956 and came down to the last weekend. The Dodgers won. And I've always been intrigued by that whole experience. So I wanted to write a book about the Deadball era. I wanted to write a book about a dramatic close pennant race. And when you go through the seasons in the National League, there aren't a lot of options. I mean, there's the 1908 season, which has been well chronicled. And then there's the 1916 season that nothing had been written about, no books had been written about. And to make it even better, the Dodgers are the ultimate. Was a lifelong Dodger fan. The Dodgers were the National League champion. So it was the ideal topic for me to work on, to choose.
One of the interesting things about your books that I've really enjoyed is that there's a narrative flow to them, which is hard to do sometimes in baseball nonfiction, where the game stories kind of get in the way of being able to create a narrative flow. And you've done that. I mean, the Ebbets book too. It's fun to read. I guess is there any particular techniques you've used to do that? How have you done that? Is that something you've consciously tried to do?
I think that what I've tried to do is to try to make the people, the subject, whether it's Ebbets or the ball players, to make them appear as real people, not just faces on a page. That's hard to do in the Deadball era because there's nobody you can interview. Fortunately, let's take the Ebbets book. Fortunately, the Baseball Hall of Fame library has what are described as the minutes of the National League owners meetings, but in fact, what they really are verbatim transcripts of what the owners actually said. So you go through those and you can read what Ebbets literally said at these meetings as he argued different issues. For example, what I like to call the Great Schedule War of 1910, where Ebbets and Barney Dreyfuss have this ongoing struggle about whether can you really play 168 games in a season. And so you're able to read what Ebbets said to Dreyfuss, what Dreyfuss said back, and it makes them, I think, three-dimensional people who you can better appreciate. The same thing as far as games are concerned. There are so many different. One key game in the 1916 season, I read about 15 to 20 articles about that game and found just one little piece that told about how the Philadelphia Phillies now felt that they were over the hump and they were going to win the National League pennant. And I can present a sense of their feelings, make them human. I think that's probably one of the major things that I tried to do.
So before we get into your books, I do now have to ask you about writing with your son. You've written one book with him and edited a book with him. I've co-authored a book with Mark Armour, a couple of our books, and I've enjoyed it. And so I'm curious what just generally co-authoring, and then the fact that it's your son and just that relationship as part of the process.
Well, as far as working with Paul was concerned, it was basically a great opportunity, and the timing was right. He had graduated from college, and he was off to live in the greater Boston area, so we didn't see each other that much, and it was hard to find things to do together. And we both love baseball; it's our favorite sport. He had just given up a short foray as a sports writer and wanted to keep writing, and I wanted to write this book, and so. It was a wonderful opportunity for the two of us to work together on something, and we enjoy. I know we both enjoyed every minute of it. As far as working with another person is concerned, in my experience, it does two primary things. It enables you to expand what you do. In the 1916 book, I could never have written about both the National League and the American League, but I could do the National League, Paul could do the American League, and so we could cover a greater area. The other thing I think it enables you to do is to match your strengths or interests to the specific areas. In the Ebbets Field book, a big part of it was interviewing former Dodger players and opposing team players about their experiences at Ebbets Field. Paul is a much better interviewer than I am. And so he was able to do that. And I could concentrate on the research on some of the things that I think I'm, if not at least as good at, or I'm more interested in. So but I think the thing that made both of these projects a little bit easier is that it was easy to divide the workload. I think if you're both writing about the same, topic, you have to divide that up. It would be a lot more difficult. And you can speak to that probably more than I can, but it worked well for us.
Did you did you edit each other's works? Because I mean, obviously it reads as one voice, which is important. And I'm just curious if you edited each other's works so that you could make it sound as one voice, or if you just sort of write similarly. How did that is a complicated thing to make work.
It is that in the 1916 book, what we did was we wrote alternating chapters. And then we did co-edit each other. We edited each other's work, tried to make it as close as possible. I'm really happy to hear you say that it sounds like one voice, because that was certainly what we were trying to do. With the Ebbets Field book, it's a little bit different because most of it is other people's work.
Sure, right. You were the editor of that, so
right. You're transcribing interviews, or you're editing other people's essays.
So talk a little about Ebbets. How you decided. I mean, obviously you're a Dodger fan, so maybe that was it. But what captivated you about Ebbets and made you wanted to spend so much time living with him?
Well, he was. I wrote the first essay in our book about Ebbets Field, which was a chapter about Ebbets, about the building of Ebbets Field. But in researching that, he seemed to me to be somebody who had been presented as a really two-dimensional, not a real person. He was a caricature. He was cheap. He was this kind of person who couldn't control what he said in public, so he was always doing embarrassing things. Kind of a clown. He was often presented as being a clown, and that just didn't sound correct to me. So I wanted, and no books had been written about him, so that was an appeal to me. And the other thing that I liked about it is that I could bring some personal experience or knowledge to the effort. I never had a lot of success as a baseball player, so I can't really write or think about what it's like to hit a curveball or steal a base. But I had a 35-year career in both corporate banking and not-for-profit finance, so I have some experience with finances, and I was able to bring that to Ebbets' dealings as an owner. For example, one of his biggest blunders was the way he handled the financing of Ebbets Field. Really caused a lot of future problems after he and one of the McKeevers was gone. And I knew enough about real estate projects to be able to write about how it should have been done and what his errors were. So the ability to bring that kind of knowledge to the project was something that made it appealing to me.
No, that's great. I mean, you look for subjects that I feel the same way, where you can bring some of your own knowledge of the world to that. So more for Ebbets than the 1916 book, but either book. Talk a little about context, right? I mean, part of the importance of these history books is historical context, and I to me that's what makes it fun about reading history, is the relationship to today. So talk a little about the importance of context, how you bring it, what you try and do when you are writing history.
I think, it's not an original idea with me, but I think the thing to always keep in mind is that history is lived forward, but it's written backward. We know the end before we know what it was to only know the beginning. And so I always try to write it as if it's in the present time. And to do that, you have to understand the world that the people lived in. Ebbets, as I said earlier, his big reputation, he had a big reputation for being cheap. Well, I wanted to try to understand what the attitude was of people at that time towards money. And fortunately, there was a prominent reporter named Mark Sullivan who wrote a 6-volume history of that era called Our Times. And in the first volume, he talks about the values that people learned about money. And much the same way that we say we don't want to waste food today. Well, in that era, the lesson was don't waste money. There's certainly times when you could argue that Ebbets was cheap, but he also learned that money was valuable and it should be used for whatever. You don't waste it. You use it for those purposes. And I hope it enabled me to give a more in-depth picture of his attitude towards money, and that, he's not the cheapskate that he was portrayed,
Right.
caricatured as many times.
So maybe you've talked about a couple, but a couple of more surprising things that you learned about Ebbets. It sounds like one was just regarding the financing of Ebbets Field, because he obviously he lost half the team as a way, and
Right.
maybe as a way to bail that out. And then the other is sort of having to do with his cheapness. I mean, is there anything else you want to share, or anything more on those two? I mean, those are both really interesting things that I think people understand.
I can say a little bit about more about the financing, and then there's one other thing I'd like to say that basically his approach to the finance, basically the way that you should do a construction of a big real estate project like that is you line up your long-term financing, that is your mortgage, ahead of time, and then you have some kind of construction financing to get you to the final product. Ebbets didn't do any of that kind of stuff. He had no financing in line and set up. And then when it comes to the end, he's running out of money. And there's literally in 1913, the summer of 1912, rather, he's going to the different owners in the National League begging for money. And you're right. Finally, the only way that he can find to finance it is he takes the McKeevers in as 50-50 partners. The problem with that, of course, is if you're 50-50 partners, how do you resolve disagreements? And it worked well. There were 2 McKeevers, Steve and Ed. The 3 of them were alive. It worked reasonably well. Ebbets dies in April of 1925. Ed McKeever dies a few weeks later because of a cold that he caught at Ebbets' funeral. And then from then on, there is this bitter infighting between the Ebbets heirs and the McKeever heirs that ends up with the team being sold, which ends up ultimately with the team being owned by Walter O'Malley. So, you can connect all those dots. The other thing, having said something negative about Ebbets, let me say something positive about him that I don't think is well known, which is the role he played in fighting for how the minor league draft was conducted. At the time, the only draft was the minor league draft. I think today it survives as what's called the Rule 5 draft. The way the draft worked was that the drafting order was done by lot or by chance. You just pick names out of a hat. So, for example, in 1906, when the Chicago Cubs win 116 games, theoretically, they could have been the first team chosen, and they could have had the first choice in the draft, which hardly seems conducive to any kind of parity. Ebbets fought a long battle towards changing that so that the team with the worst record in the prior year got the first draft choice. And it went beyond the Deadball or beyond his death before it was finally put in place. But if you think about it, that's the norm in every professional sport today. And Ebbets was a real pioneer in it. People didn't want to hear that idea, which is surprising, but that's the way it was, and he fought for it.
So let's move on a little bit. Thank you to the 1916 book, and you did introduce it a little bit. We introduced it a little bit already, but we're talking about some of the challenges of writing a book about a single season, so that you create the narrative arc without getting bogged down in the minutia, and yet you still sort of have the fun of telling all these great little stories along the way.
Well, there are two challenges. The first one is just the enormity of the material. Most people know of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle as the main paper in Brooklyn. There are three other papers in Brooklyn. The papers in New York City are probably beyond count. So, you have to go through a huge amount of material, and it's very difficult to even do that, even if you're only focusing on a few teams. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, in 1916, there are 4 of the 8 National League teams are part of the story in September. So that's a lot of material you have to cover. The real challenge, I think, is that what I wanted to do, I think what you really need to do in a book about a pennant race like that is you want to capture the drama of that winner take all pennant race as it comes down the stretch. With 4 teams, there are a lot of games that are involved in that. If you're not careful, you can get bogged in all these fascinating details that fascinate you, but lose the reader. The reader doesn't get that sense of the drama. So that's the one side. The other side is you try to do it too generally, and you just say, well, they won 3 games that week, and you don't get into some of the twists and turns that led to those victories. You're still missing the point. So, navigating those waters is very challenging, and it takes a lot of time.
Is there anything in particular that surprising that you found researching the 1916 season that um, share here?
Yeah, there are 2 things that stand out. One is the nature of road trips at that time in the Deadball era. Both leagues are 8-team leagues. You take the National League, you've got 4 Eastern teams, 4 what are called Western teams, and you have to take the Dodgers. You have to play the Western teams 11 times in their home ballpark. So the way they did that was you made 3 long road trips to the West, and the Western teams have to do the same thing. It reaches its point of absurdity in mid-August of 1916 when the Dodgers go on a 28-game road trip. They visit first all the 4 Western teams, come back, and then all this travel, by the way, is on railroads that aren't air conditioned, staying in hotels that aren't air conditioned. They visit all the Western cities. They come back, and then they visit the 3 Eastern cities, all 7 cities, 28 games before they play home again. They started with a 3-game lead, came home with a 1.5-game lead. I don't know how they did that. It was a remarkable achievement. The good news, once they got home, they had a 25-game homestand to finish the season. Right. It was a big surprise to me. The other thing, very briefly, is some of the records that were set in 1916 that will never be broken. 4 starting pitchers in 1916 pitched both ends of a doubleheader and won. It's not relief pitchers. They started and finished both ends of a doubleheader, a record that'll never be broken. Grover Cleveland Alexander pitched 16 shutouts, again, a record that'll never be broken. And the one record that may be broken but still stands, the New York Giants won 26 consecutive games. And ironically, they started in 3rd place and 4th place, and they ended in 4th place.
That is fascinating. So let's talk about the 3rd book that, has some Deadball era content in it, the book you edited on Ebbets Field. Maybe talk about some of the challenges of editing a book, working with both the interviews and sort of transcribing those and making that interesting to people. And then secondly, working with other authors and managing that process.
Yeah, the challenges are they are different. You're basically, let's take the other authors first. But what you're trying to do is you've got certain topics you want to cover. You have to recruit the people to do that. I was very fortunate in the people that 2 of the 3 people I already knew. And the other person was recommended to me very quickly, and they were experts in their field, did their work quickly, and required very little from me. The other part of the book was interviews with fans and former players, and that's about finding people, and it's a challenge finding people who who had been to Ebbets Field. You know, the book was written a long time after Ebbets Field had closed. You have to find them. You've got to get them agree to talk to you. And then the way it worked, let's take what you really had to do was you had to prepare it. We had to prepare a transcript of every interview, send it to the person who did the interview, and have them sign a permission slip that this was authentic. And that was a lot of work. Again, fortunately, the people were very cooperative. Paul did most of the player interviews. I was very fortunate, though, that I got to interview Carl Erskine, which is an experience I'll always treasure. And from a literary standpoint, I got to interview Bob Caro, Robert Caro, the Pulitzer Prize winning biographer of Lyndon Johnson, and Robert Moses, one of my literary heroes. So that was just an unforgettable experience. And my wife got to speak briefly with Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is one of her literary heroes. So it was well worth it. I have to say that I didn't find it as stressful as writing a book. Probably because you're doing less direct stuff yourself. You're not checking your own work as often. So.
Well, maybe we'll even get Robert Caro's. We're still waiting on that final volume to the Johnson, right? We got one more coming, so
yeah.
Well,
he's
hopefully
88,
we'll get it.
so yeah. I just read his just to digress for a moment. His book, The Power Broker, is in its 50th anniversary year, and supposedly 50,000 copies have been sold this year of a book that's 50 years old. Just think about that.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's great. So maybe talk about a couple of surprising things that you had from that effort. Particularly just any of the people that were. I mean, but you just said them. You got to talk to Robert Caro, who I would have loved to have talked to. That must have been fun. But just any sort of other anecdotes before we move on from you sort of talking about your books in particular.
The thing that stood out the most is that I grew up a Brooklyn Dodger fan. I grew up with the experience of the Yankees winning almost all the time. And so that, in the neighborhood I grew up in, the Dodgers were kind of like, who cares? Not regarded very highly. And then I interviewed Dick Groat and Randy Jackson. And all they could talk about was how great those Dodger teams were and how much they didn't want to go to Ebbets Field and have to play the Dodgers. And I realized, that there were 16 major league teams, and the Dodgers were clearly the second best team. They were a great, great team. They just didn't have that success in the World Series. And so it was something that that really stood out. The other thing that I'll just mention in the Carl Erskine interview, we talked on the phone for about an hour. And after about 45 minutes, he said, well, I guess I've taken enough of your time. And there was no way that could be true. But we talked another 15 minutes and hung up. And I was about to go outside and do something. And the phone rang. And it's, hi, I'm Carl. It's Carl Erskine. I forgot something.
That's really great.
Yeah.
That's really great. So let's just sort of go on to a little bit just on the techniques and your take on writing. How long does it typically take you to write a book?
The books with McFarlane are typically under a 2-year contract. So we worked pretty comfortably within that window. The Ebbets book probably should have taken longer. I think a biography by definition really needs to take more than 2 years. The other books, I think, comfortably were done within 2 years. That's 2 years, 2 retired years from any other employment.
Well, and I'm guessing that since these were interests of yours, you probably had done some pre-research as well, and that you weren't starting from scratch maybe on the 1916 season in detail, but at least with Ebbets, you probably had some sense of them.
Right. No, I was definitely not starting from scratch. I had done some research into him, yes.
So is there, talk a little maybe about the difference between writing a book or doing a biography and doing the book on 1916, if there's any other, I know you've talked about it a little bit here so far, but are there anything in particular that you felt like, okay, this is what I need to do for a biography, but I need a different process in any way for an annual kind of book?
I don't know about a process. I think that the challenge is for a biography like Ebbets. Ebbets worked for the Brooklyn Dodgers for 42 years. So you're covering, just an incredible period of time. Whereas for a season, if you go back to spring training didn't last very long in those days. You're talking like 7 months. So it's very different. How to navigate your way through 42 years is a real challenge. The thing that changed when when we did the 1916 book, let's take the Dodgers as an example. The primary source was the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. Fortunately for me, the Rutgers University Library, about 45 minutes from here, has a full run of the Eagle on microfilm. Now, but I still had to go there and spend countless hours printing out microfilm of every game account. I could never have written the Ebbets biography under those conditions. But fortunately, when I started working on it, it was available on newspapers.com. And not only, was it readily accessible, I didn't have to print it all out. So it's
Right.
a lot easier, a lot less paper in my attic from that one. So that's a kind of a major difference, I think.
So for those of you watching, we probably have a couple more questions. So if you want to type questions into the chat, we can pass those along to John here as we finish up. So what's the most important lesson or most interesting lesson that you've learned through your writing process?
The thing that I think that I've learned is the most important is to learn how to write in your own voice. In my first book was a history of the 33rd New Jersey, a Civil War regiment. In July of 1864, they took part in the Battle of Peachtree Creek, and it was their worst battle of the war. They suffered their highest casualty levels, but it was also their last battle of the war. There's a bitter irony there. If you survive the battle, then even though you didn't know it at the time, you were never going to be in a battle again. If you didn't survive, there's the tragedy of if you just been someplace else, you on assignment, you could have lived a long and productive life. When it came time to write about that, I started out by saying, if life is unfair, then war is the unfairest part of life. A friend of mine read the book and she told me, that's your voice. Now, I didn't think of it that way at the time, but what happened was that I had the material, I thought about the material, and I thought about what I wanted to say about it, and I think that is my voice there. And I think the key to writing, it's hard work, and you can't do it on every page even, but it's taking all this material and then finding what you want to say about it, so it's your voice, your book or essay or whatever.
So I'll just throw out to the gang here too, before we ask a couple more questions. I think if people raise their hands, I can unmute you and you can ask a question verbally if you'd prefer. So, we've talked about all the stuff that you've done. What's in the future, John? What's the next book project or essay or what do you want to do next now?
Yeah. I'm definitely going to continue writing my blog, which after the vintage season ends on Saturday, will convert to baseball history. And I'll keep writing for the Inside Game probably as long as Don Jensen will have me. As far as books are concerned, there are two topics that are of interest. One is the National League pennant race of 1949, which merits a book, although I'm not sure I have the capacity to write it. From the Deadball era standpoint, the topic that's of interest is the sports writers of the Deadball era, an area that I feel is vastly understudied and probably would lend itself to a SABR type book with biographies of the writers and that kind of thing. Again, if I'm not sure I have the capacity to do it, but those are the things that I'm at least thinking about. I also need my wife's permission, and I'm not sure that would be forthcoming. So.
No, those all sound fun, and yeah, hopefully you can get to some of them. So we have one question here from Arthur Mills. Sean, was the Dodgers move to the West Coast inevitable? A little bit out of the dead ball, but
Right.
what's your take?
It's definitely not inevitable. I mean, uh, the Dodgers are the one team that moved that was financially successful. I mean, there was no reason that that had to happen. Um, for decades, Walter O'Malley got all the blame. Now it's shifted to Robert Moses getting his fair share of the blame. I've always thought that the elected officials in New York City, especially Robert Wagner, the mayor, deserves some of the blame. I mean, if you read the different books about it, Robert Wagner couldn't care less whether the Dodgers and Giants left New York City. And in no sense was it inevitable. It's a tragedy.
Well, John, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So this has really been fun. Really appreciate your. Guess we'll give it one more minute if anyone wants to type something in, or I could take you off mute if someone wants to ask. But otherwise, this has been great. Great books, and so thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks for everybody who took part.